Hello and welcome to Chapter 8. This chapter will deal with events following the election of 1800. So, this is going to be largely Jefferson's uh, presidency, but we're going to carry that on through to the era of good feelings and up through James Monroe as well. And I have the opening picture here is of a map of the United States. And you can see in green there the established territory of the United States. The bit in sort of orangey yellow belongs to Spain, so that's Florida, and most of Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, those areas like that. You can see the Louisiana territory in the kind of pinkish shade there, and Oregon up there in purple. And I kind of want you to keep this map in the back of your head because the colors and designations on that map are going to change by the end of this chapter. And so kind of keep that in mind as you are listening to the rest of this lecture. So in the election of 1800, you see the victory of Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans over John Adams and the Federalists, and we enter into an age that is most frequently referred to as Jeffersonian, named after, of course, Thomas Jefferson. And this is a period where we get a real idea of Jefferson's philosophy on government. Jefferson himself was an extraordinary individual. He was fluent in French, he read Greek and Latin, he studied several Native American languages. He served for more than 20 years as the president of the American Philosophical Society. He was a student of architecture, designing his own house, Monticello. He was an inventor, and of course, well-known statesman. He was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He served as governor of Virginia, ambassador to France, the Secretary of State, and vice president until finally being elected as president in 1800. He was at the time, and still is today, something of a controversial figure. He expresses in various writings some doubts about Christian doctrines, which are very frequently quoted in arguments about religion today. And his early support for the French Revolution also led to some controversy, tending to connect him to sort of radicalism. The Federalists alleged that he kept a slave mistress, and basically accusing him of essentially being a hypocrite. Jefferson condemned the idea of race mixing, but these accusations of him keeping a slave mistress and even having children by her appears to sort of contradict these earlier ideas and make him out to be a hypocrite, although this did very little damage to Jefferson's reputation in Virginia. Jefferson didn't believe that blacks and whites could live permanently side by side in American society, and he feared that to do so might lead to a race war. He also worried that things like high taxes and standing armies and corruption had the potential to destroy American liberty by turning government into the master rather than the servant of the people, and so he advocated for state governments to retain some control, and in fact a considerable amount of control. He also believed that popular liberty required popular virtue, and virtue consisted of a decision to place the public good ahead of one's private interests. The most vigilant and virtuous people, therefore, had some direct state stake or direct connection to the country, and usually this connection was through property ownership. And he was very, as a result, wary of cities and urban areas as breeding grounds for mobs and other menaces to liberty. Jefferson describes his own election as a revolution in order to restore the liberty and tranquility that he thought the United States had enjoyed in its earlier years, and to reverse what he saw as a drift towards despotism under the Federalists, and especially John Adams. The national debt, roughly $10 million worth of national debt, which grew under the Federalists, was alarming to Jefferson and his Secretary of the Treasury, and they together rejected Hamilton's idea that a national debt would help to strengthen the government by giving creditors a stake in the health of the country. Just paying the interest on the debt would require taxes, which would suck money from industrious farmers, and so ultimately harm the country itself. And so Jefferson wanted to see that debt actually go away. Increased tax revenues, he argued, also might tempt the government to establish things like a standing army, which was seen as the ultimate threat to liberty. And so, under his administration, he secured the repeal of a lot of taxes. They slashed expenditures by closing some overseas embassies, as well as reducing the size of the army. In his inaugural address, Jefferson struck a kind of conciliatory note. He traced the political convulsions of the 1790s to different responses to the French Revolution, and declared that Americans actually agreed on the essentials. However, foreign affairs continued to plague American politics. Jefferson's enemies characterized him as a kind of dreamy philosopher, and even his friends conceded that national defense was not necessarily Jefferson's strong suit, as might be demonstrated by considering his war with the Tripolitan pirates in 1801 to 1805. Jefferson had hoped to conciliate with the more moderate Federalists, but conflicts over the judiciary derailed that particular objective. Washington and Adams had appointed only Federalist-leaning judges to the bench, including the new Chief Justice, John Marshall. Jefferson saw the Federalist-sponsored Judiciary Act of 1801 as sort of the last straw. By reducing the number of Supreme Court justices from 6 to 5, the act threatened to strip him of his opportunity to appoint a Republican-leaning justice. At the same time, the act created 16 new federal judgeships, not on the Supreme Court, but lower courts, in which outgoing President John Adams was able to fill at the last minute. These were referred to as the midnight appointments. Most of the appointments were able to reach their people in time, so that they were able to take the bench, but one of them famously didn't. In 1802, Jefferson managed to secure the repeal of the Judiciary Act, but those judges still took the bench, the ones that managed to receive their commissions. The one who didn't was William Marbury. He was named as the Justice of the Peace for the District of Columbia, and when Jefferson's administration came into office, his Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to send Marbury his notice of appointment on the orders of Jefferson. Marbury then petitioned the Supreme Court to issue a writ which would compel the delivery, and this resulted in the famous case Marbury versus Madison. In that decision, Chief Justice John Marshall really establishes the sort of purpose of the Supreme Court. He decides that although Madison ought to have delivered the commission, which was by rights Marbury's, he was under no legal obligation to do so, because part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which granted the court the authority to issue a writ which would compel Madison to do so, was unconstitutional. And so in this, Marshall and the court managed to strike on this issue something of a moderate stance, but they make a decision which has repercussions far into the future. And this establishes a principle of judicial activism. The idea that the Supreme Court has the ability and even the right to expunge a law that is contrary to the Constitution, which they did with the Judiciary Act of 1789. They said that this part of the act was unconstitutional, and therefore nothing in it compels someone to act in accordance with it, which is the decision handed out. And this has far-reaching consequences. It basically becomes the definition of the job of the Supreme Court, which is to determine the constitutionality of laws as we see it today. And this ability was not necessarily written into the Constitution, but it's something that develops through the actions of Marshall and his court. The Republicans didn't like this. Jefferson especially didn't like this. He didn't necessarily reject the principle, but he didn't like that Marshall used part of his decision to lecture Madison on his moral duty, which was telling him that he ought to have delivered the assignment. The Republicans generally took offense against the judiciary by moving to impeach, i.e. charge with wrongdoing, two Federalist judges, John Pickering and Samuel Chase. Pickering was an alcoholic, and he was quite easily removed from office. Samuel Chase proved to be much more difficult. He was a partisan Federalist, but the Constitution specified that judges could be impeached only for treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors, and being particularly partisan didn't fit any of those descriptions. Jefferson himself objected neither to judicial review nor to an appointed judiciary. He merely challenged Federalist use of judicial power for political goals. Yet, this is a very common gray area between law and politics. And in fact, it's something that existed before this episode and has continued to exist since this episode. It's very difficult to separate yourself as a judge from your politics as a person. And for that reason, you have judges that are labeled as a conservative judge or a liberal judge or a moderate judge, even today. So it's an ongoing issue with the judiciary. So Jefferson's goal of avoiding foreign entanglements, as per Washington's advice in 1796, would ultimately remain beyond his reach as long as the European powers had large land holdings in North America. Spain, at the time, owned East Florida, as well as the Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans, after a sort of secret treaty with the French. The Spanish gained control of the Louisiana Territory. And it also claimed West Florida, which now makes up the southern portions of Alabama and Mississippi. In 1800, Spain was particularly weakened, and so took the opportunity to return the Louisiana Territory to France. France, which is now under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. And this was scary to Jefferson. Napoleon was generally scary to everyone, of his neighbors anyways. And Americans were no different, as this basically placed a despotic individual with ideas of world domination right on the back door of our new fledgling country. Jefferson had long imagined the inevitable expansion of the free and virtuous American people to create an empire of liberty. Spain hadn't necessarily been an obstacle to that, but Napoleon might prove to be so. Napoleon, on the other hand, dreamed of recreating a French world empire. And the island of Saint Dominique would sort of be the fulcrum around which that empire balanced, basically, because it was the main sort of sugar making, exporting colony that the French owned. It was the most profitable that they had. And his idea was that Louisiana could be developed to be sort of a breadbasket in order to feed Saint Dominique. The only problem was that there was an ongoing revolution in Saint Dominique, which would have to be subdued first. It was a slave revolt, basically, which resulted in the takeover of government by a former slave. And in order to deal with that, Bonaparte dispatched an army to reassert French control and reestablish slavery. But the army was ill prepared, first for the outbreak of yellow fever, which struck them almost immediately, and for the fierce resistance by the former slaves on Saint Dominique. And so French force was basically doomed from the beginning. Without Saint Dominique, Louisiana territory seemed less useful for Napoleon, and so he started to look for a way to possibly get rid of it. Jefferson, on the other hand, not really knowing Napoleon's inner thoughts about this, was most concerned about New Orleans. Western American farmers had began sending their produce down to the port of New Orleans to ship out because it was easier to send it downriver than to try and ship it across the mountains to eastern markets. Spain had allowed us to use New Orleans as a port with relatively little hassle, but just before they transferred it back to the French, they cut off access to the port, and the French carried on with that under Napoleon. And so Americans were left in a bit of a pickle in New Orleans. The combination of France's failure to subdue the slave revolt in Saint Dominique and the termination of American rights to use the port of New Orleans led to America's purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson first dispatched a pair of negotiators, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, to Paris to initially buy New Orleans from France. That was all he wanted. And they were authorized to offer a sum of money just for the port of New Orleans. Meanwhile, as I said, Napoleon saw very little value in the territory of Louisiana now that Saint Dominique, his sort of cash cow, was gone, and he was attempting to drum up financial support for an invasion of Britain, which never actually came about, and so he needed the cash. And instead of selling New Orleans, he actually agreed to sell the entire area of Louisiana. And the price that the negotiators and Napoleon's representative settled on was roughly $15 million. Now, this was definitely a steal, but there was some concerns. This basically meant that Jefferson was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The reality of the situation was that the purchase was almost too good to pass up. But Jefferson's ideals as a strict constructionist with regards to the Constitution meant that he, in accepting this purchase, would be taking on a power not specifically allowed to him by the Constitution. And it would be going against his own personal principles as to how the government ought to run. Ultimately, the decision was in favor of expanding the country because it would be beneficial. But it was a major dilemma for Jefferson, and he did work very hard to get around it. And your purpose with the sort of research assignment this semester is to take on that decision and that internal struggle that was Jefferson's in compromising between necessity and principles. Ultimately, we did acquire Louisiana, as you all know, and the acquisition of it left the Federalists rather dispirited and without a real popular national issue that they could then use in the election of 1804. As that election approached, the main threat to Jefferson was not the Federalist Party, but actually his own vice president, Aaron Burr, who kind of resented being the vice president ever since he became it. The adoption in 1804 of the 12th Amendment required separate ballots for president and vice president in the Electoral College and clarified the electoral process, but it didn't end Burr's conniving. He had spent a lot of his vice presidency in intrigues with the Federalists to try and overthrow Jefferson. And the Republicans ultimately dumped him for the vice presidential ticket in favor of George Clinton. Jefferson's overwhelming victory brought a very fitting term, or close to the end of his first term. And the immediate business of his second term was to figure out what it was that he had actually purchased in 1804. The actual territory of Louisiana was relatively unexplored for the most part. And so he appointed his own personal secretary and fellow Virginian Meriwether Lewis to explore the new territory, to go from the Missouri River, trace it all the way to its source, because maybe it would go all the way to the Pacific. It doesn't go all the way to the Pacific, in case you're wondering. And see if you could find a water route that would do. And otherwise document what they run into, the people, the tribes, the plants, the animals, all of those sorts of things. Just kind of figure out what's out there. Lewis invited along his close friend, William Clark, as kind of second in command, and they relied on a French-Canadian fur trader as a guide and interpreter. He was somewhat slow-witted and inclined to panic whenever crisis came around, so his utility to the company was somewhat questionable. However, his wife, who was a Native American lady called Sacagawea, proved to be extremely useful. She was probably only about 16, maybe 17 years old at the time, and had just given birth to their first child, her and her husband. And having this young woman, as well as a young infant, along on the expedition was useful in conveying the "we come in peace" message to anyone they ran into. They eventually made it to the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805 and then returned to St. Louis, but not before collecting a mass of scientific information as well as geographical information about the territory. So as I touched on earlier, the main challenge for Jefferson was not from the Federalists, but rather from within his own party in the form of his vice president. And Aaron Burr was kind of having a bad time of it. He had suffered a string of reverses in 1804, and after he was denied the renomination as vice president, he entered into a series of intrigues with a faction of despairing and rather extreme Federalists in New England, known as the High Federalists. This group plotted to sever the Union by forming a pro-British Northern Confederacy, and they settled on Aaron Burr as their leader and helped him to gain the Federalist nomination for the governorship of New York. Now, Alexander Hamilton had more or less left active participation in politics, but of course he was still interested, and he was almost single-handedly responsible for thwarting Burr's grab for the presidency in 1800 And so he was already not a favor with Aaron Burr. Now, in this race for the New York governor position, he foiled Burr yet again by allowing the publication of his, as Burr described it, despicable opinion. Defeated in the election and thoroughly shamed by this article, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel in July of 1804. Now, dueling was a very interesting practice at the time. It's not at all how you would picture it, sort of pistols at noon, you walk 10 paces and turn around real quick and try and shoot each other at the same time. That wasn't how duels really worked in this day and age. Duels here tended to consist of gentlemen standing a number of paces apart. They were facing each other, and they actually shot at each other one at a time. So if you were hit but not wounded or mortally wounded by your opponent, then you would have the opportunity to shoot at them. Hamilton wasn't a particular fan of dueling. He actually had a son who was killed in a duel, and so he was kind of anti the practice. But he agreed to the duel anyway, for reasons unknown as far as I'm concerned. And he intentionally threw the match. He shot into the ground, which would usually require the opponent to do the same thing in order to be, honorable. That way, the duel was fought, the slight would be taken care of, but nobody was seriously hurt. Despite Hamilton doing this, though, Aaron Burr took very careful aim and shot and mortally wounded him. And so Hamilton was very much cut off in his prime. Aaron Burr was actually indicted in 2 different states for murdering Alexander Hamilton. But Burr at this point was still vice president. And he was also hatching a scheme to very boldly change his political fortunes. He decided to ally himself with the rather unsavory military governor of the Louisiana Territory, a man called James Wilkinson. Wilkinson had been on the payroll of Spain intermittently as a kind of secret agent in the 1780s. And the plot between he and Burr was to create an independent confederacy now of western states and to use that as a base to conquer Mexico and invade West Florida. By the fall of 1806, Burr had about 60 followers, and they were making their way down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in order to join up with Wilkinson at Natchez in what is now Louisiana, the state of Louisiana. In 1806, though, Jefferson denounced the conspiracy. Wilkinson abandoned the plot and proclaimed himself the most loyal of Jefferson's followers. Burr attempted to escape to West Florida, but he was intercepted and brought back, and now he's put on trial for treason. Chief Justice Marshall was presiding at the trial and instructed the jury that the prosecution had to prove actual treasonable acts, which is basically impossible because the conspiracy never actually reached fruition. Nothing ever really happened. It just remained a plan. And while Marshall was right, the wording of the Constitution was extremely clear. And it was done so deliberately to make treason very difficult to prosecute and to prove, because, of course, it is a very extreme offense. But despite the fact that Marshall was just sticking to the Constitution, Jefferson was absolutely furious with him because he actually wanted to see a conviction for Aaron Burr. Burr was, however, still under indictment for his murder of Hamilton and ended up fleeing to Europe. Besides that conspiracy, Jefferson also faced a challenge from a group of Republicans led by a fellow Virginian, John Randolph. Randolph believed that governments were always a menace to popular liberty, and Jefferson had originally shared this view, but once he was in office, he was forced to kind of compromise on that, because in effect he was seeing government from the other side of the argument, from within the government. Randolph then turned on Jefferson because Jefferson was starting to moderate, and most notably turned on him for backing a compromise in a specific land scandal. The Georgia legislature had sold a huge tract of land at a fraction of its value to land companies that had bribed virtually the entire legislature. The next legislature canceled the sale, but a lot of investors, knowing nothing of the bribery, had already bought land in good faith. The Federal Commission then compromised with an award of 5 million acres to investors, and Randolph felt that the compromise was itself a scandal and further evidence of the decay of Republican value. And so Jefferson's now starting to get stuck in hot water, as it were. So all of these conspiracies, Aaron Burr's as well as John Randolph's taunts, were starting to break that aura of invincibility that had surrounded Jefferson. But now, foreign affairs rather than domestic disputes were becoming an even bigger challenge. Britain and France resumed their war in Europe, and U.S. merchants had prospered from the war by carrying sugar and coffee from the French and Spanish Caribbean colonies into Europe itself. They traded not only with Napoleon, but also drove down the price of British sugar and coffee, and the British were, of course, not happy about this, and they concluded that their economic problems within Britain stemmed from the Americans' actions, and so took action directly against the Americans. For the Americans, our economic boom depended on the re-export trade, which tended to evade British regulations. According to the British Rule of 1756, any trade closed during peacetime could not be opened during war, and if it was, the British would stop it. The U.S. response to this rule was to carry goods on a broken voyage, by which U.S. ships would carry French sugar or coffee to American ports, unload it, pass it through customs, and then re-export it as not French goods, but American goods. In 1805, the British initiated a policy of total war towards France, including the strangulation of French trade, and declared that broken voyages were now illegal. Next, you have a series of trade decrees coming out of Britain, known collectively as the Orders in Council. This established a blockade of French-controlled ports on the coast of Europe, and Napoleon responded to this with his so-called Continental System, which was a series of sort of counter-proclamations saying that ships obeying British regulations would be subject to seizure by France. And this resulted in the virtual outlawing of any U.S. trade or commerce. Because anytime we tried to trade with France, Britain would get mad because we'd be in violation of the Orders in Council, and accepting the Orders in Council and acting accordingly would then put us in violation of the Continental System, and so then the French would steal American shipping. And so the Americans are kind of stuck in this tug of war with the two big powers of the day, Britain and France. Both countries proceeded to seize American ships, but the British seizures were far more humiliating to the Americans. France was a much weaker naval power than Britain was, and most of their seizures occurred in European ports rather than on the open ocean. In contrast, the British warships would hover just beyond the American coast and catch the ships almost before they'd even left American waters. The Royal Navy would then stop and search virtually every American vessel that came out of cities like New York or Boston or Philadelphia. To all of these provocations, the British also added a policy of impressment. The Royal Navy had long utilized press gangs to drum up their numbers whenever it was necessary. These press gangs usually operated inside Britain itself. They would haunt port towns or anywhere really. And if you were unlucky enough to be a young man who was healthy and not with your wits about you, all by yourself, then you could find yourself kidnapped and forced into the British Navy, and this was popular and accepted practice. Britain increasingly extended the practice to seizing any alleged Royal Navy deserters who happened to be on merchant ships, American merchant ships. Now, this was a well-known problem. The British Navy was not a very pleasant place to be, and a lot of times sailors found that they could get better pay, better working conditions working on American merchant vessels, and so actually there were quite a lot of Royal Navy deserters on American merchant ships. And the American ships didn't necessarily have an issue with the Navy grabbing British citizens, but what the American government did take issue with was that American-born seamen were also subject to impressment, with the British often making the argument that once you were a British citizen, you were always a British citizen, and it didn't matter that America had won its independence from Britain, Americans were still British, which is something of a roundabout argument. Roughly 6,000 Americans between 1803 and 1812 were impressed into the Royal Navy, and it was very difficult to get somebody out of that once they were grabbed. Difficult and expensive. While he was making some preparations for war, for some kind of violent response to this, Jefferson adopted a policy of peaceable coercion by suspending trade with both Britain and France in order to gain respect for neutral rights. But by far the most controversial legislation was the Embargo Act of 1807, and this prohibited vessels from even leaving American ports for foreign ports. Technically, it only prohibited exports, but the practical effect was to stop imports as well as exports, because very few foreign ships would venture into American ports if they would have to then leave without any kind of cargo as well. The embargo didn't actually have the effect it intended. The intention was that it would keep both American sailors and American ships safe in American ports so that they couldn't, either of them, be seized by either the British or the French. However, British sales to the United States dropped by about 50% following the embargo, and the British very quickly found new markets in South America where there were a number of rebellions against Spanish colonial rule. The Embargo Act also contained some loopholes. For example, it allowed American ships that were blown off course to put in at European ports if necessary, and so you see a massive leap in the number of ships that are blown off course. Napoleon also seized any American ships that he could lay his hands on, and then informed the United States that he was only helping to enforce the embargo, which wasn't what we intended to happen either. The United States saw itself feeling the harshest effects of the embargo at home, which was definitely an unintended consequence. American seamen often found themselves out of work. Roughly 30,000 American seamen found themselves out of work, and hundreds of merchants went into bankruptcy because they had no way to actually do business. And the jails started to fill with people who couldn't pay their debts because they relied on trade in order to make their livelihood. Farmers were also devastated because they were unable to export their produce and unable to sell it at a decent price to hard-pressed urban dwellers who weren't making any money because they couldn't actually work. Speculators who had purchased land, expecting to sell it later at a higher price, also took a beating because the cash-starved farmers were unable to buy land. So pretty much everybody was hurting from this decision. The embargo hit New England the hardest, and most especially Massachusetts, in which twice the ship tonnage per capita was shipped out of Massachusetts than in any other state. The situation was not entirely bleak, however. The embargo did force a diversion of merchants' capital away from commerce and into manufacturing, and so you get the earliest American efforts at manufacturing taking place more or less out of necessity during the embargo. But none of this comforted the merchants or already ruined mariners who were filling up the soup kitchens and the like, nor could New Englanders forget that the source of their misery was a policy initiated by one of the Virginia lordlings, which was Jefferson. Jefferson, who knew very little about New England, and who had a dogmatic loathing of cities as the very foundations of New England's prosperity. And so you see some really tense conflict surrounding this particular law. Even before the Embargo Act, Jefferson had announced that he would not be a candidate for re-election in 1808. And with his blessing, the Republican Congressional Caucus nominated James Madison as his successor. The Federalists staged a somewhat modest comeback, managing to gain 24 congressional seats, but Madison still won a pretty decisive victory for the presidency, and the Republicans did retain control of Congress. The Federalist revival, modest as it was, rested on two factors. The first was opposition to the Embargo Act, which gave the party a national issue that it had lacked in the previous elections. The younger Federalists had also abandoned their elders' sort of gentlemanly disdain for campaigning and deliberately imitated the vote-winning techniques of the Republicans. Madison, who was commonly referred to as Little Jimmy because he was 5 feet 4 inches tall, seemed a somewhat weak and shadowy figure compared to Jefferson. Madison continued the embargo with only minor changes once he got into office, and like Jefferson, he reasoned that Britain was probably more vulnerable in her commerce than in her armies, thinking that the only real way that we're going to convince Britain to do anything that we want is to hit them in the pocketbook, more or less. However, the American embargo wasn't doing any real coercion for anyone. And on March 1st, 1809, Congress replaced the Embargo Act with the weaker face-saving measure called the Non-Intercourse Act. This act opened trade to all nations except Britain and France, and then authorized the president to restore trade with either one of those nations if it would stop violating our neutral rights. Neither country complied with that demand, and in May of 1810, Congress substituted the Non-Intercourse Act with a new measure known as Makin's Bill No. 2. This opened trade with Britain and France, but then offered a bribe saying that if either nation would repeal its restrictions on neutral shipping, the U.S. would halt trade with the other one. Neither one particularly took us up on that either. And none of the laws had the desired effect. While Jefferson and Madison lashed out at France and Britain as moral demons, the belligerents saw the world as composed of a few great powers and quite a lot of weak powers. And whenever the great powers went to war, there was no such thing as neutral. The weak powers simply had to take sides. And so neither one had any intention really of accommodating the Americans as a weak power. A peaceable coercion became something of a fiasco, and Madison came under fire from militant Republicans. These were known as war hawks, and they demanded much more aggressive policies to deal with these international snubs. This group came mainly from the South and Western regions, where something like honor was sacred. And the militants were infuriated by the insults, essentially, to American pride. In addition to that, economic recession between 1808 and 1810 convinced a lot of them that British policies were wrecking their region's economies. The Warhawks called for the expulsion of the British from Canada as one of their main issues, and the expulsion of the Spanish from Florida. These demands merged with the demands of Western settlers who feared that the British in Canada were actively recruiting Native Americans to stop, or at the very least harass, American settlers. In reality, American policy, not necessarily meddling from the British, was the source of a lot of bloodshed on the frontier. Jefferson believed that Native Americans and white settlers could live peaceably together, unlike white settlers and blacks, but only if Native Americans would abandon their hunting and nomadic lifestyles and take up farming. If they farmed, they would need less land, and Jefferson and Madison later insisted that the Native Americans be compensated fairly for any land they gave up. The reality of the situation, however, conflicted very sharply with these ideals. The march of white settlement was steadily shrinking the native hunting grounds, and the natives themselves were becoming more willing to sign away land in payment to whites for things like blankets and guns and liquor. In 1809, no American was more eager to acquire native lands than William Henry Harrison, who was then the governor of the Indiana Territory. The federal government had divided Indiana, splitting off the present states of Illinois and Wisconsin into the separate Illinois Territory, and Harrison recognized that with the loss of that territory, Indiana would not be able to achieve statehood unless it could attract more settlers by offering them land that was currently owned by Native Americans. Disregarding the instructions from Washington to negotiate with the natives who claimed the land, Harrison rounded up a delegation of half-starved Native Americans, none of whom lived on the lands that he wanted, and essentially tricked them into signing away that land at a price of roughly 2 cents an acre. The tribes that did actually live on that land were completely outraged at the maneuvering, and among the angriest was a Shawnee chief by the name of Tecumseh and his brother, who was popularly referred to as the Prophet. He, the Prophet, had had a frightening dream in which he saw drunken Native Americans tormented for eternity, and as a result he gave up liquor and began pleading with his fellows to return to their old ways and avoid contact with white settlers. Tecumseh sought to build a coalition of several tribes in order to stem the tide of white settlement, which was somewhat more productive. He insisted that the native lands belonged collectively to all the tribes and so could not be sold by groups that had splintered off. Harrison, however, concluded that it was time to attack the natives and get them off the land which he had rightfully stolen out from under them. And the target of this attack was a Shawnee encampment called Prophetstown near the mouth of the Tippecanoe River. Conveniently for Harrison, Tecumseh was away recruiting southern tribes to his cause, and so his brother, who was not a very good warrior, ordered an attack on Harrison's encampment. They were vastly outnumbered in both men and ammunition, and his force was beaten off, but only after inflicting heavy casualties. The Battle of Tippecanoe had several large effects. One, it made Harrison a national hero, which was a reputation that he would eventually use to run for president. It also completely discredited the Prophet, whose conduct during the battle drew quite a lot of criticism from his followers, and it also elevated his brother Tecumseh into a position of recognized leadership among the tribes. And finally, it persuaded Tecumseh, who had long distrusted the British as much as the Americans, to form an alliance with the British against the Americans. By the spring of 1812, President Madison had decided that war with Britain was ultimately inevitable and unavoidable. An economic depression struck Britain only partly because of the American policy of restricting trade with that country, and it was finally starting to actually have an impact. And so at the time that Madison is determining that yes, we're probably going to have to go to war, merchants in Britain were pressuring Parliament to suspend the orders in council. And eventually Britain agreed to do that on the 23rd of June. The only catch was that the American Congress had passed a declaration of war only a few days prior to that. So now the Americans are stuck going into a war that nobody really wanted to get involved in. Neither the War Hawks nor the Westerners held the key vote in favor of the war. Votes of Republicans in populous states like Pennsylvania and Maryland were the main force which propelled the declaration of war through Congress, whereas opposition came mostly from the Northeast, with its Federalist strongholds. Congressional opposition to the war was therefore relatively sectional as well as partisanly split. In his war message, Madison listed impressment, the continued presence of British ships in American waters, and British violations of neutral rights as grievances that justified war. None of these complaints, however, fully explains why the Americans went to war in 1812 rather than earlier, for example, in 1807. Madison also listed British incitement of Native Americans as a stimulus for war. However, a more important underlying cause was economic recession, which affected the South and the West after 1808, as well as the conviction held by John C. Calhoun and others that British policy was actually actively damaging America's economy. Finally, it was also vitally important that Madison rather than Jefferson was president in 1812. Jefferson believed that Britain was motivated primarily by its desire to defeat Napoleon, and once that war ended, then the provocations would stop. And so therefore, Jefferson would have been very unlikely to agree to any kind of declaration of war. Madison, on the other hand, held that Britain's real motive was to strangle American trade once and for all, and thereby eliminate the United States as a trading rival. And with that, it only took a relatively small amount of provocation for Madison to agree to the rather extreme step of going to war. So, although American cruisers, most notably the USS Constitution, would win a few sensational battles with British warships, the U.S. Navy could not hope to really compete with the British, nor prevent them from clamping a naval blockade on the American coast. Canada, which Madison viewed as a key prop of the British Empire, became the principal target for Americans in the War of 1812. Very few Americans expected a long or difficult struggle. However, there was very little justification for this level of optimism. Although a lot of Canadians were immigrants from the United States, to the American surprise, they fought fiercely to repel the American invaders. Many of the best British troops were fighting Napoleon in Europe, but the British enlisted Native American aid and used the fear of these uncontrollable savages to force American surrenders. Very few militiamen also understood the goals of the war. There was not a lot of bloodlust, for example, in 1812, and opposition to the war ran extremely strong in regions like New England. For a lot of Americans, local attachments were also still a lot stronger than national ones, and so there wasn't the same kind of patriotic fervor to get into this war in the way that there was for the Revolutionary War. Roughly from the summer of 1812 to the spring of 1814, the Americans launched a series of unsuccessful attacks on Canada, with most notably an attack near Queenstown, or in Queenstown, near Niagara Falls. This was led by an American force, including a number of New York militiamen. The militiamen contended that they had volunteered only to fight for their homes in New York and not to invade Canada, and so they watched from the New York border while the American forces were overwhelmed in Canada. American forces lost Detroit and could not retake it while the British controlled Lake Erie. So during the winter of 1812 and 1813, Captain Oliver Perry constructed a fleet of vessels, and on September 10th finally was able to destroy a British squadron on Lake Erie. The British then pulled out of Detroit, unable to sort of secure the lakeside, and American forces under General William Henry Harrison overtook and defeated a combined British and Indian force in the Battle of the Thames. The British then took the offensive in the summer of 1814. By that time, the European War with Napoleon was over. Napoleon was safely exiled on the island of Elba, at least for the next year or so he was. And so the British were able to divert their full attention to the United States. And the British were able to introduce veterans of the Napoleonic Wars into the American War of 1812. So the Americans were feeling the full brunt of British military might. General Sir George Prevost led a force of 10,000 British veterans in an offensive that was meant to split the New England states off from the rest, New England being the seat of opposition to the war. After his fleet met with defeat on September 11th, Prevost abandoned his campaign altogether. Ironically, the British achieved a far more spectacular success in an operation which was originally designed as a diversion from the main thrust. The British Army landed near Washington, D.C., and met a much larger American force composed mainly of militia. The Battle of Bladensburg very quickly became the Bladensburg Races as the American militia fled in the face of an army of British regulars, almost without firing a single shot. The British then proceeded on to Washington, D.C., where Madison, who had witnessed the fiasco at Bladensburg, had to escape quickly into the Virginia hills in the middle of the night. In fact, they were about to sit down to dinner, and when the British commander came into the White House, Madison's dinner was still hot on the table, and he availed himself of it before quickly torching the house altogether. They torched not only the White House but other public buildings in Washington, and a few weeks later attacked the city of Baltimore, which was the last defense, basically. And it was very probable that had Baltimore fallen, there would have been a different end to the War of 1812. However, the British were unable to crack the American defenses at Baltimore, and they broke off the operation entirely. In August of 1814, negotiations began to discuss the end of the war between British and American commissioners at Ghent. News of an American naval victory at Plattsburgh, as well as Prevost's retreat to Canada, brought home to the British that after 2 years of fighting, they controlled neither the Great Lakes nor Lake Champlain. The Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war and was signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, and agreed to restore the status quo antebellum, or rather to put things back to the way they were before the war started, with neither side gaining nor losing territory. There were several additional issues that were fixed in the treaty as well, including fixing a boundary between the United States and Canada. And there were future commissions called in order to establish, or to settle rather, future settlement. The end of the war in Europe also made neutral rights a dead issue, and so nothing was particularly said about that. Owing to communication problems, America's arguably greatest victory of the war took place, in fact, after the war had officially ended on January 8th of 1815, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. The British Army descended on New Orleans just before that in order to attack the city's defenders, and U.S. troops, commanded by General Andrew Jackson, were left to defend the port. Jackson and his group of sort of ragtag militia and farmers and regular army managed to halt the advance of the British and inflict more than 2,000 casualties whilst only losing about 13 of their own. That was one thing that, had communications been better, probably would have never happened, because, of course, it took place after the war. Another thing that probably would have never happened, had communications been better, was known as the Hartford Convention, and this was basically the final nail in the coffin of the Federalist Party. Although it meant nothing in terms of the war, the Battle of New Orleans had a devastating effect on the Federalist Party in that it was shown to discredit the ideas that came out of the Hartford Convention itself. The Federalists had been making a comeback in the election of 1808, and that continued into the election of 1812, when their candidate lost the electoral vote, but carried all of New England, with the exception of Vermont, New York, and New Jersey. American military setbacks in the war intensified Federalist disdain for Madison's administration, and a few began to talk of New England's secession from the Union. In late 1814, a Federalist convention met at Hartford, Connecticut, and although some advocates of secession were present, moderates mostly took control and passed a series of resolutions summarizing New England's grievances. The grievances lay in the belief that New Englanders were becoming a permanent minority in a nation dominated by Southern Republicans who failed to understand New England's commercial interest. They proposed then to amend the Constitution to abolish the Three-Fifths Clause, which gave the South a disproportionate share of votes in Congress, and require a 2/3 vote in Congress to declare war, as well as to admit new states into the Union. They also voted to limit the president to a single term in office, and prohibit the election of 2 successive presidents from the same state, and to bar any embargoes that lasted more than 60 days. However, news of the Treaty of Ghent and of Jackson's victory at New Orleans reached the East Coast roughly the same time, which led a lot of Americans to believe that the War of 1812 ended with a military victory rather than a negotiated peace. And it pretty much dashed any hope the Federalists might have had of gaining any broad popular support for the agenda that came out of the Hartford Convention. The goal of the Hartford Convention was not necessarily to promote disunion, but more to promote the idea of states' rights. However, to many who were on the outside of proceedings, thought that it sounded more like a traitorous plot than anything else. And ultimately, this spelled the end for the Federalists in national politics. So America emerges from the War of 1812, bruised but still intact. The war managed to produce more than its share of symbols of American nationalism. Whitewashed and cleared of smoke, and smoke damage rather, the presidential mansion thereafter became known as the White House, and also stood as a national symbol. The British attack on Fort McHenry, guarding Baltimore, prompted one young observer, Francis Scott Key, to compose a poem, the Star-Spangled Banner, which would ultimately become our nation's national anthem. And even the flag itself that flew over Fort McHenry would become a long-standing symbol of American nationalism. The Battle of New Orleans managed to boost Andrew Jackson onto the stage of national politics, and it appears to most contemporary scholars that the British lost largely because they advanced within range of Jackson's riflemen and cannon, inexplicably. However, the Americans at the time spun a different and much more patriotic tale. A legend arose that Jackson owed his victory not to the mistakes of the British, but to the hawk-eyed Kentucky frontiersmen whose rifles picked off the British with unerring accuracy. While in fact a lot of frontiersmen in Jackson's army hadn't carried rifles at all, and even if they had, gunpowder smoke would have obscured the enemy, but none of this mattered at the time. Just as Americans preferred militia to professional soldiers, they also chose to believe that their greatest victory of the war had been the handiwork of amateurs rather than the mistakes of their enemy. The War of 1812 also had two major political consequences. One, it eliminated the Federalists as a national political party. And two, with the Federalists no longer a force, the Republicans increasingly embraced doctrines that had long been associated with the Federalists. For example, the expiration of the charter of the First Bank of the United States in 1811 forced the government to plead with private bankers for wartime loans. And that proved to a lot of Republicans that having a national bank at their disposal was actually a good idea, even though they had ardently fought against it. In December of 1815, James Madison called for the creation of a new national bank, which was labeled the Second Bank of the United States. He also called for things like federal support for internal improvements, such as roads and canals, and tariff protection for new industries that sprang up during the embargo. In Congress, yet another Republican, Henry Clay of Kentucky, proposed similar measures, which he labeled his American System, with the aim of making the young nation economically self-sufficient and free from dependence on Europe. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States and enacted a moderate tariff. Federal support for internal improvements proved to be somewhat more difficult. As the so-called national Republicans now adopted positions they had once disdained, an era of good feelings began to dawn on American politics. However, the good feelings were paper thin. Madison's 1817 veto of an internal improvements bill revealed the persistence of disagreements about the role of the federal government under the Constitution, and the continuation of slavery was starting to arouse sectional animosities. The post-war consensus began to unravel almost as soon as Americans realized that it existed. In 1819, Jefferson's old antagonist John Marshall, who was still Chief Justice, issued two opinions that stunned the Republicans. The first of these was Dartmouth College versus Woodward, and in that decision, Marshall concluded that the college's original charter, granted to its trustees by George III in 1769, was a contract. And because the Constitution specifically forbade states to interfere with contracts, an effort by New Hampshire to turn Dartmouth into a state university was therefore unconstitutional. The implications of this ruling were far-reaching for businesses as well as colleges. A few weeks later, he handed down yet another momentous decision in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. This case reflected popular outrage at the disclosure that managers of the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States had embezzled about $1.5 million. Maryland responded then by imposing a tax on the branch of the National Bank and sued McCulloch, who was one of the embezzlers, when the bank refused to pay the tax. These events raised two important issues. First, did Congress have the power to charter a national bank? And speaking for a unanimous court, Marshall conceded that nothing in the Constitution explicitly granted that power. But a broad sweep of enumerated powers implied the power to charter a bank existed. The second thing that came up was, could a state tax an agency of the federal government that lay within its borders? Again, speaking for a unanimous court, Marshall argued that any power of the national government, enumerated or implied, was supreme within its sphere. This meant that states could not interfere with the existence of federal powers, and it very firmly asserted that the national government was superior to the state governments in all things. Marshall's decision in the McCulloch case dismayed many Republicans, especially the rather strict Jeffersonians who revered individuals like John Randolph and were coming to be known as the Old Republicans. And although Madison had supported the establishment of the second bank, the bank had made itself unpopular by tightening its loan policies during the summer of 1818, which triggered a financial panic in 1819. A severe depression gave rise to considerable distress throughout the country, especially among Western farmers. And at the time, the bank was widely held responsible for this panic. Marshall's ruling then stirred controversy by placing the bank beyond the regulatory power of any state government. And this decision was as much an attack on state sovereignty as it was a defense of the bank. The Old Republicans regarded the compact theory of the Union as a guarantor of popular liberty and saw it, the decision in McCulloch, along with the decision in Dartmouth College, as stripping the state governments of a power to impose the will of their people on corporations. The fragility of the era of good feelings became even more apparent in the 2-year-long controversy over statehood for Missouri. Missouri tended to attract slaveholders. And in 1819, when the House of Representatives was considering a bill to admit Missouri as a state, 16% of the territory's inhabitants were slaves. A New York Republican offered an amendment that would prohibit the further introduction of slaves and provide for the emancipation at age 25 of all slave offspring born after Missouri's admission as a state. Following a rather intense debate, the House accepted the amendment. However, the Senate rejected it, and both chambers voted along sectional lines. Prior to 1819, slavery had not been the primary source of the nation's sectional divisions. But the Missouri question now thrust slavery into the center of the long-standing sectional debate. In 1819, the Union had 11 free and 11 slave states, and the admission of Missouri as a slave state would upset that balance. Missouri was on the same latitude as the free states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and Northerners worried that admitting Missouri as a slave state would set a precedent for the extension of slavery into the northern part of the purchase. Finally, the disintegration of the Federalists as a national force reduced the need for a unity among Republicans, so that sectional pressures more than party loyalty became the predominant force in Republican politics. Virtually every issue that would rack the Union during the next 40 years was present in the controversy over Missouri. You have Southern charges that the North was conspiring to destroy the Union and end slavery. You had accusations from Northerners that Southerners were conspiring to extend the institution. Southerners openly proclaimed that anti-slavery Northerners were killing fires that only seas of blood could extinguish. Kindling fires, excuse me. A series of congressional agreements, known collectively as the Missouri Compromise, ultimately resolved this crisis but left the overall tensions unaddressed. In order to balance the number of free and slave states, Congress in 1820 agreed to admit Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. And to forestall any further crisis, it also prohibited slavery in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 divide, which was the southern boundary of Missouri. The compromise didn't come easily, and the individual components of the eventual compromise had to pass, and only passed by close sectional votes. No sooner had the compromise been forged than it began to fall apart. Missourians drafted a constitution which prohibited free blacks, whom some eastern states viewed as citizens, from entering their territory. This provision clashed with the federal constitution's provision that citizens of one state were entitled to the same rights as citizens of other states. Balking at the exclusion of free blacks, anti-slavery Northerners began to bar Missouri's admission into the Union, and that lasted until 1821, when Henry Clay engineered a new agreement. The Second Missouri Compromise prohibited Missouri from discriminating against citizens of other states, but left open the issue of whether free blacks were in fact citizens. The Missouri Compromise was widely viewed as a Southern victory. And while the North had merely gained Maine, whose rejection of slavery inspired no controversy whatsoever, the South had conceded to freedom a vast block of territory north of the 3630 line, which some viewed as unfit for white habitation. It was largely inhabited by Native Americans. The Missouri Compromise also reinforced the principle originally set down by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that Congress had the right to prohibit slavery in some territories. However, this question would come up again and again and again before finally being settled by civil war. Unlike domestic policy, American foreign policy between 1816 and 1824 reflected far more consensus than conflict. The end of the Napoleonic Wars and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent removed most of the foreign policy disagreements between the Federalists and the Republicans. Moreover, James Monroe was fortunate to have as his Secretary of State an extraordinary diplomat in the figure of John Quincy Adams. Adams moved very quickly to strengthen the peace with Great Britain, and during his tenure, the United States and Britain signed the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, which effectively demilitarized the Great Lakes. The British-American Convention of 1818 also restored Americans the same fishing rights off Newfoundland that they had enjoyed before the War of 1812, and fixed the boundary between the United States and Canada permanently. The vast country known as Oregon was also declared to be free and open to both American and British citizens. And as a result of these two agreements, the United States had a secure border with British-controlled Canada and a claim to the Pacific. The new nation now turned its attention to dealing with Spain, which still owned East Florida and also claimed West Florida. No one was particularly certain whether the Louisiana Purchase included West Florida, but acting as if it did, the United States in 1812 simply added a slice of West Florida to the state of Louisiana, and then another slice to the Mississippi Territory. Using the pretext that it was a base for Seminole Indian raids and a refuge for fugitive slaves, Andrew Jackson, without actually any authorization from his superiors, invaded East Florida in 1818 and ended by hanging 2 British subjects and capturing a string of Spanish forts. Jackson had acted without any explicit orders, but Adams supported the raids, guessing correctly that it would panic the Spanish into further concessions, and in 1819 Spain agreed to the Adams-Onís Treaty. By its terms, Spain would cede East Florida to the United States and renounce its claims to West Florida. And the two also agreed to a southern border for the United States west of Mississippi, by which the United States conceded that Texas was not part of the Louisiana Purchase. Spain then agreed to a northern limit to its claims on the west coast. John Quincy Adams had long believed that God and nature had ordained that the United States would eventually span the entire continent of North America, and he made it clear to Spain that if the Spanish did not concede some of their territory in North America, then the U.S. might seize all of it, including Texas and even Mexico. Yet Spain was concerned with larger issues. Its primary objective was to suppress revolutions against Spanish rule that had broken out all over South America. And it sought the support of European monarchs. European monarchs formed the Holy Alliance in 1815, which was the brainchild of the Tsar of Russia, and it was aimed at quashing revolutions everywhere in the name of Christian and monarchist principles. Britain had trading interests in South America, and these were hampered by Spanish restrictions, and they refused to join the Holy Alliance. And the British foreign minister proposed that the U.S. and Great Britain issue a joint statement condemning European influence in South America, while pledging that neither would annex any part of Spain's old empire. While sharing this opposition, Adams preferred that the United States make the declaration all by itself, and flatly rejected Canning's insistence on a joint pledge, never to annex Spain's former territories, mainly because Adams wanted the freedom to possibly annex Texas or Cuba or both in future. This was pretty much the background to one of the more famous doctrines of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. And this doctrine announced three key principles when it was issued on December 2nd, 1823. These were that unless American interests were involved, U.S. policy was to abstain from European wars, that American continents were not subject for future colonization by any European power, and that the United States would construe any attempt at European colonization in the New World as an unfriendly act. Europeans widely derided the Monroe Doctrine as an empty pronouncement, and it was probably fear of the British Navy more than the Americans that prevented the Holy Alliance from intervening in South America. But the doctrine did have some important implications. The United States was voluntarily excluding the possibility that it would support any revolutionary movements in Europe, and it was also using the Monroe Doctrine to claim a preeminent position in the New World, which may not mean much now, but it would become important in the future.